Hello friends, I am Vitaly Portnikov. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, emphatically emphasized that he is shortening the deadline of his significant ultimatum, which was given to the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, from 50 days to 8 to 10. The 50-day deadline of Trump's ultimatum was supposed to end at the beginning of September. However, it is quite telling that the President of the Russian Federation has still not responded to the statements of his American counterpart. Only the Deputy Chairman of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, Medvedev, and the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov made disparaging comments regarding Trump's warnings. However, even their reaction left no doubt that the Kremlin does not intend to respond to the statements of the American president for now. However, as is known, Putin's press secretary Peskov emphasized that it is Putin himself who should respond to Trump's 50-day ultimatum. Why was there no such response? Because the Russian president realized that this time mere words and promises would not be enough to influence Trump. And the President of the United States himself said today that he has already spoken enough with Putin about ending the Russian-Ukrainian war and is no longer interested in new contacts with his Russian counterpart. Thus, at the very least, some kind of action was expected from Putin that would show he is paying attention to Trump's statements. But the Russian president, who is entirely focused on continuing his brutal war against Ukraine and is deeply convinced that a years-long conflict will ultimately allow him to completely destroy the hated neighboring state, was certainly not planning to take any such action at all. And thus, Putin truly found himself in a stalemate. Making any statements, even flattering ones, towards Trump will no longer have the same political effect as such statements did in the first months of Trump's time in the Oval Office. Taking any action such as a 30-day ceasefire is unrealistic given Putin's focus on continuing the war and preparing a new offensive against Ukraine, as well as the ongoing mass terror against the civilian population, which may have somewhat decreased after Trump's ultimatum, but as we can see, has not stopped. Every day we hear about the destruction of residential buildings and the deaths of civilians in Ukrainian cities and towns. And this shows that Putin has no intention of abandoning terror against the civilian population of Ukraine, considering it one of the steps to intimidate our people and to convince them that only capitulation to Russia can end the war. Of course, with such a position from the Russian president, who is focused on war and killings, the American president cannot agree. And that is why Trump essentially acted in the same way as he did during Israel's war against Iran, when he also set the first deadline for the Iranian leadership to agree to arrangements that would lead to abandoning their nuclear program. And when he saw that no one in Tehran was paying attention to his warnings, he decided to use American weapons against the nuclear facilities in the Islamic Republic, and did so several days earlier than he had warned. The Russian president can now see that, in relations with Moscow, his American counterpart is following the same path. And thus, it is impossible to count on any real advance warnings when they are issued by Donald Trump. Moreover, when Trump announces deadlines for warnings, it may be nothing more than a cover for the true intentions of the United States and the actual timelines in which certain measures against states hostile to the United States may be prepared. And it is precisely into such a state that Putin's Russia is rapidly transforming before our very eyes, a country with which Trump tried to establish cooperation and whose citizens, as we have heard from his statements, are still spoken of with sympathy. All that's left is to understand what the President of the United States will actually do in these 8 or 10 days. With Iran, everything was clear. The United States was ready to use its own military to put an end to the Islamic Republic's nuclear program. With the Russian Federation, of course, the situation does not look as convincing. It is obvious that right now, Donald Trump is not ready for the direct involvement of the American military in a war with Russia. Of course, one could agree to increase military aid to Ukraine by providing our country with modern weapons that could be used against military targets on the territory of the Russian Federation itself. However, so far, Trump has ruled out supplying Ukraine with long-range weapons that would help destroy targets on Russia's sovereign territory, including those very same sites used to terrorize the civilian population of our country. Economic sanctions are indeed quite an important and significant matter, and if secondary sanctions are imposed against the energy partners of the Russian Federation, this could become a rather serious and impactful signal for all those nations who continue their cooperation with Moscow. However, judging by the initial reaction to Donald Trump's statements about 50 days, it is clear that countries like India, which are interested in a strategic partnership with the United States and are counting on Washington's support in their confrontation with Beijing, may indeed refuse at least the majority of Russian oil or disguise the receipt of this oil so that it reaches India through third countries. This, of course, would significantly reduce both the volume of this oil and the revenues of the Russian Federation's budget. But as for the Chinese leadership, I have serious doubts that anyone in Beijing would agree to Donald Trump's 100% tariff and refuse to purchase Russian oil. More likely, Beijing will agree to impose reciprocal tariffs against American goods, which in turn could negatively affect the situation of the American economy itself, as was already the case during the previous round of the tariff war between Washington and Beijing. We heard directly from the US Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent that the United States is indeed planning to hold important negotiations with the People's Republic of China regarding the potential purchase of oil from both Iran and Russia. And of course, Washington would like Beijing not to support the aggressive actions of these countries through its purchases. But for the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, President of the People's Republic of China Xi Jinping, economic assistance to Russia and Iran precisely means weakening the influence of the United States in the world. China is unlikely to agree to the American ultimatum. And here again arises the most important question: what will Donald Trump actually do when not 50 but 8 or 10 days remain of the current new ultimatum from the American president to his recently favored Russian counterpart? Thank you, friends. Subscribe to my social media, to my channel on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and Donatello, which help support the development of these resources. Make use of the sponsorship feature right here on YouTube. Victory and peace. Good luck!